Welcome to Greyvale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Not all ghosts are spirits. Some are the lingering whispers of betrayal, secrets hidden in dusty rooms, waiting for a stormy night to be revealed. Sir Philip Harclay now seeks human answers to a ghostly warning, and finds them in an unlikely place. The violent, jarring return from the dream world left Sir Philip Harclay a changed man. He was no longer just a man with a suspicion. He was a man with a terrible and sacred certainty. The ghostly vision of the subterranean grotto, with its weeping stones and the spectral, blood-stained sword hanging in its oppressive, dark heart, was not a memory that faded with the coming of the bleak, grey dawn. It was a permanent and searing fixture in his mind, a scene of such vivid, nightmarish clarity that it had become more real to him than the cold, solid stone of the chamber in which he had awakened. The dream was a message, a map, a divine and dreadful directive from the tormented spirit of his murdered friend. He now knew, with an unshakable conviction that defied all rational thought, that somewhere deep beneath the foundations of Lovell Castle lay a hidden cavern, and within that cavern, submerged in a dark and secret pool, was the very instrument of Lord Lovell's murder. He sat on the edge of his bed as the morning light struggled to penetrate the gloom, the cold sweat of the nightmare still clinging to his skin. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scoured and raw, the sky a canvas of bruised, mournful purples and grays. The howling wind had died down to a low, sorrowful moan that whispered through the castle's ancient eaves. A profound and heavy silence had fallen, the silence that follows a great and violent catharsis. But for Philip, there was no peace. The ghostly vision had given him a terrible, burning certainty, but it had also left him with a profound and frustrating helplessness. He had the answer to the mystery, but it was an answer whispered by a ghost, a map drawn in the ephemeral ink of a dream. He could not simply march up to the new Baron, a man he now knew in his heart to be a murderer, and declare his intention to start tearing up the castle's foundations in search of a phantom cave and a spectral sword. He would be laughed at, declared mad, and likely thrown in a dungeon or quietly disposed of before he could get anywhere near the truth. The ghost had shown him the what and the where, but it had not provided him with the how. The weight of his sacred promise to the restless spirit in the armory settled upon him with a new and crushing gravity. He was the sole keeper of this terrible secret, the chosen champion of a murdered man. The burden of action was his and his alone. He paced the floor of his chamber, his heavy riding boots making soft, rhythmic thuds on the cold stone. His mind a whirlwind of frantic, desperate thought. He needed proof. Not the proof of ghosts and dreams, which was valid only to him, but tangible, earthly proof that would be recognized by the world of men. He needed a thread, a starting point in the real world that he could pull on, a thread that would eventually lead him back to the terrible, supernatural truth of the grotto. The supernatural had shown him the destination, but he now needed a mundane path to get there. He had to re-examine everything he thought he knew, to look for the small, human cracks in the facade of the new Baron's legitimacy. His strategic, soldier's mind began to take over, pushing aside the lingering horror of the dream and focusing on a clear, logical course of action. The new Baron Lord Lovell's own brother, Sir Walter, had taken control of the castle and the title with a speed that was, in itself, suspicious. To unravel his treachery, Philip needed to understand exactly what had happened in the days and weeks immediately following his friend's supposed death from a fever. The official story was a neat, tidy narrative, but Philip knew that great crimes were rarely so clean. There would be loose ends, whispers, inconsistencies. But the castle's nobles and ranking servants would be loyal to their new master, either through fear or favor. They would offer him nothing but polite smiles and carefully rehearsed stories. He needed a different source of information. He needed to seek out the common folk. The true history of a great house, he knew, was not always written in the grand ledgers in the records room. It was written in the memories of the people who served it, the people who were as much a part of the estate as the stones and the soil. The tenants, the farmers, the stable hands, the kitchen maids, they were the eyes and ears of the castle. They saw the comings and goings at odd hours. They heard the whispered arguments behind closed doors. They noticed the strange, nervous behavior of their so-called betters. Their loyalty was not to the title but to the man. And the men and women of the Lovell estate had been fiercely, almost fanatically, loyal to his friend, the late lord. They would not have transferred that loyalty so easily to a new master they barely knew, especially one whose character was, by all accounts, deeply questionable. There, among the common folk, he might find the thread he so desperately needed. His decision made, a new sense of purpose, cold and hard as steel, settled over him. He would leave the cold, oppressive silence of the castle and ride out onto the estate. The sky was still overcast and threatening, the air damp and heavy, but he paid it no mind. He dressed with the quiet efficiency of a man preparing for battle, pulling on a simple, dark, and unassuming cloak that would not draw attention. He made his way to the stables, his manner calm and purposeful, nodding politely to the guards who watched him with a cold, suspicious curiosity. He saddled his own horse, a powerful gray destrier that had carried him through many a real battle, and felt a small sense of comfort at the familiar, solid presence of the animal. As he rode out of the castle gates, leaving the heavy, oppressive atmosphere behind him, he felt a small measure of relief, a sense of taking action, of finally moving forward. He rode not towards the main road, but onto the smaller, muddier tracks that wound through the Lovell family's extensive lands. The storm had turned the paths into a quagmire, and his horse's hooves made thick, sucking sounds in the mud. He passed by the small, humble cottages of the tenant farmers, their thatched roofs dark and heavy with rain, thin plumes of smoke rising from their chimneys into the gray, damp air. He was looking for one cottage in particular. He was searching for the home of an old farmer named Elric, a man whose face was as wrinkled and as weathered as a winter apple. Elric had served the Lovell family his entire life, as his father and his grandfather had done before him. He had been one of the late Lord's most trusted tenants, a man respected for his quiet wisdom and his unswerving, dog-like loyalty. If anyone would have noticed something amiss in the days following Lord Lovell's death, if anyone would be willing to speak of it to a man they knew to be the late Lord's truest friend, it would be old Elric. He found the cottage nestled in a small, sheltered valley, a humble but well-kept dwelling with a neat, if currently rain-battered, vegetable garden. He dismounted, the soft, muddy ground silencing his approach, and knocked on the simple, wooden door. After a moment, the door creaked open, and the old farmer stood there, his ancient, pale blue eyes widening in surprise, and then in a deep, sorrowful recognition. "Sir Philip?" the old man whispered, his voice as dry and as rustling as autumn leaves. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound and genuine respect. "It is an honor, sir, though a sad one, that brings you to my door." Philip, seeing the honest grief and loyalty in the old man's face, knew he had come to the right place. He had found his thread. The search for earthly clues, for a human truth to corroborate a ghostly revelation, had begun. The old farmer, Elric, ushered Sir Philip Harclay into his small, humble cottage with a deference that was both poignant and deeply touching. The contrast between the cold, oppressive grandeur of Lovell Castle and the simple, genuine warmth of this small dwelling was immediate and profound. The cottage consisted of a single, low-ceilinged room, its rough-hewn wooden beams darkened by the smoke of generations. A small but cheerful fire crackled and spat in a large stone hearth, its flames casting a warm, flickering orange glow that danced across the packed earth floor and the simple, hand-carved wooden furniture. The air was filled with the comforting, domestic sense of wood smoke, of drying herbs that hung in bunches from the rafters, and of baking bread. It was the smell of a simple, honest life, a life lived in harmony with the seasons and the soil, a world away from the cold, secret-haunted stones of the castle on the hill. An old, gray-muzzled dog, lying by the hearth, lifted its head, thumped its tail twice on the floor in a gesture of welcome, and then settled back into its slumber. Elric guided Sir Philip to a sturdy wooden chair by the fire, the best seat in the house, before shuffling over to a small table to pour 2 cups of home-brewed, spiced ale. The old man's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from a combination of great age and a deep, respectful solemnity. He was a man whose face was a roadmap of a long and laborious life, every wrinkle a testament to a harvest gathered or a winter endured. But his eyes, though faded and clouded with age, were sharp, clear, and filled with an unwavering, intelligent light. This was a man who saw much and said little, a man whose wisdom was rooted not in books, but in the deep, patient observation of the world and the people around him. He handed a cup to Sir Philip, his movements slow and deliberate. "Your presence does an old man's heart good, Sir Philip," Elric said, his voice a low, dry rustle, like wind through a field of barley. "But it is a heavy heart I feel, for I know it is a great and terrible sorrow that brings you back to these lands." He settled himself on a small stool opposite Philip, his own cup held loosely in his gnarled, work-worn hands. He stared into the dancing flames for a long moment, his ancient face a mask of profound and deeply felt grief. "You are right, Elric," Philip replied, his own voice low and grave. He took a sip of the ale. It was strong and warm, and the simple, honest heat of it felt like a balm to his chilled soul. "I have come because my heart is troubled. I was a friend to your lord, to our lord." He corrected himself, including the old man in his circle of grief. "His death, the manner of it, it does not sit well with me." A flicker of something agreement. Understanding. Perhaps even a shared suspicion passed through the old farmer's pale eyes. "Nor with any of us who truly knew him, sir," he whispered, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "He was a good lord, a strong lord, the strength of a great oak he had. Such a tree is not brought down by a common fever. It must be felled." The last two words were spoken so softly they were almost inaudible, yet they hung in the warm air of the small cottage with the weight of a leaden shroud. It was a confirmation of Philip's own deepest unspoken fears, and it was a clear signal that the old man knew more than he had let on. "Tell me, Elric," Philip urged, leaning forward in his chair, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me of the time after his death. Tell me of the night his body was brought back to the castle." The old farmer took a long, slow drink from his cup, his eyes distant, his mind clearly traveling back to that terrible night. "It was a night much like last night, sir," he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic, storytelling cadence of an old man recounting a tale he has told himself 1,000 times in the silence of his own mind. "A great storm blew in from the fells, a storm of unnatural fury. The wind howled like a legion of lost souls, and the rain came down in black, angry sheets. We all huddled in our homes, praying for the dawn, for the rage of the heavens to pass. And it was in the very heart of that storm, near midnight, that the party returned." He paused, his eyes clouding with the memory. "We heard the horns, a sad, broken sound, and we knew they were bringing my lord home, not as a conqueror, but as a corpse. I was there," Elric continued, his voice dropping even lower. "I went up to the castle gates with a few of the other tenants. It was our duty, our right, to welcome our master home one last time, even in death. The gates were opened, and they carried him in on a litter, his body wrapped in his hunting cloak, his face covered. It was a sight that broke our hearts, sir. A sight that broke the very heart of the land itself." "And the new baron?" Philip asked, his voice sharp with focus. "Sir Walter? Where was he?" A strange, dark expression passed over the old farmer's face, a look of deep, ingrained distaste. "Ah, his brother," he said, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "He was there, to be sure. He rode at the head of the party, his face a mask of what he would have us believe was grief. But it was a false mask, sir, poorly made one. I am an old man, and I have seen much grief in my time. I know its look, I know its feel. What was on Sir Walter's face was not sorrow. It was a kind of fever, a fever of excitement, of impatience, of a terrible, triumphant glee that he was trying, and failing, to hide. His eyes were never on his brother's body. They were on the castle walls, on the high towers, on the banner that flew from the keep. He was not looking at what was lost. He was looking at what he had gained." The farmer's words were a chilling echo of Philip's own observations of the new baron's character. "What did he do?" Philip pressed. "That night. That is the strangest part of all," Elric said, finally turning his pale eyes from the fire to meet Philip's gaze directly. "One would expect a man in his position to see to the laying out of his brother's body, to receive the condolences of the household, to show his grief to his people. But Sir Walter did none of these things. He gave a few curt orders to the steward, his voice sharp and brittle, and then he vanished. He did not go to the chapel to pray. He did not go to his own chambers to mourn. He went to a place no one would have expected. He locked himself away in the old records room." "The records room?" Philip repeated, a jolt of surprise and intense interest running through him. "The archives." "The very same, sir," Elric confirmed, nodding his old, grey head. "The small stone chamber off the great library, where all the old deeds and the family letters are kept. A dusty, forgotten place." He took the key from the steward, locked the door from the inside, and stayed there the entire night. He refused to see anyone. He refused food. He refused wine. The steward knocked several times, thinking his new master might be overcome with a private grief, but he was met only with a sharp, angry command to be left alone. He spent the entire, long, terrible night of his brother's return locked away in that dusty room, with the dead and their paper memories. This was it. This was the thread. A man whose brother has just died. A man who has just inherited a great and powerful title. And he spends his first night as lord not in mourning, not in prayer, but locked away in a room full of old documents. It was an act of such profound and suspicious strangeness that it could only have one explanation. He was searching for something. Or, Philip thought with a sudden, chilling realization, he was destroying something. As if reading his mind, the old farmer leaned forward, his voice now barely a whisper, a secret shared in the warm, firelit dark. "And there is one thing more, Sir Philip, a thing I have told no one else, for it is a dangerous thing to say, and I am an old man with little protection. But you were his friend. Elric paused, as if gathering his courage. Late that night, well after the rest of the castle was asleep, one of the kitchen maids had to go to the pantry, which is near the back of the library, and she smelled something, a strange, acrid smell, the smell of burning, not of wood from a hearth, but the sharp, thin smell of burning paper, of burning parchment. The old farmer's final words struck Philip with the force of a physical blow. Burning paper. On the very night his brother's body was brought home, Sir Walter had locked himself in the archives and had been burning documents. It was a confession in itself, a desperate, frantic act of a guilty man trying to erase the tracks of his crime, to destroy any evidence that might contradict his claim to the title or worse, implicate him in his brother's death. The vision of the ghost, the whisper of betrayer. And now this simple, earthly tale from a loyal old farmer, the pieces were beginning to snap together, forming a clear and utterly damning picture. Philip finished his ale, the warmth of it a stark contrast to the icy certainty that was now forming in his soul. He had what he needed. The ghost had shown him the ultimate destination, the grotto, the sword. But this old man, with his quiet wisdom and his sharp, observant eyes, had just shown him the next step on the path. He had to get into that records room. He had to see what Sir Walter had been so desperate to find, or to destroy. He had to search for the evidence that had, perhaps, escaped the fire. He rose to his feet and placed a hand on the old farmer's thin, frail shoulder. "Elric," he said, his voice filled with a deep and genuine gratitude. "You have served the House of Lovell, and the memory of your true lord, more than you can possibly know this day. You have done a brave and honorable thing." The old man simply nodded, his pale eyes shining with unshed tears. "For him, Sir Philip," he whispered. It was all for him. As Philip rode back towards the castle, the last of the storm clouds were beginning to break, a few watery rays of sunlight piercing the gray. But for Philip, the world had only grown darker. He now had a new focus, a new destination. The dusty, forgotten records room of Lovell Castle. It was a place that held the paper memories of the dead, and he now knew with a terrible certainty that it also held the secret of a murderer. Sir Philip Harclay rode back to Lovell Castle with a new and terrible fire burning in his soul. The old farmer's tale had been the bellows to the embers of his suspicion, fanning them into a roaring inferno of certainty. The strange, furtive actions of Sir Walter on the night of his brother's return, his obsessive seclusion in the castle's records room, and most damningly, the acrid smell of burning parchment. It was a sequence of events that painted a clear and undeniable portrait of a guilty man. A man desperately trying to erase the past, to destroy any inconvenient truths that might stand in the way of his newfound power. The ghostly vision of the sword had shown Philip the end of the story, the physical evidence of the murder itself. But Elric's tale had given him the beginning, the first crucial chapter in the human conspiracy that had led to that fatal, treacherous blow. His path was now clear. The armory had been the site of his supernatural revelation. The farmer's cottage had been the source of his worldly intelligence. And now, the dusty, forgotten archives of Lovell Castle would become his field of investigation. Gaining access to the records room was a delicate matter. He could not simply demand the key. Such an act would raise immediate suspicion from the new baron and his watchful steward. He needed a plausible pretext, a reason that would seem both natural and authoritative. Drawing on his official status as a named guardian in the late lord's will, he approached the steward the following morning. His demeanor was calm, professional, and tinged with a carefully measured sadness. He spoke of his duty to the young heir, Edmund, and of the need to understand the precise boundaries and holdings of the Lovell estate to ensure the boy's inheritance was properly managed. It was a perfect, unimpeachable reason. The steward, a man bound by duty and law, could not reasonably refuse such a request. After a moment of slight hesitation, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes quickly suppressed by years of ingrained deference, he retrieved a large, ornate, and rusty iron key from a heavy ring at his belt and led Sir Philip to the small, unassuming door just off the castle's grand, book-lined library. The steward unlocked the door with a loud, grating protest from the old lock, swung the heavy oak door open, and then, with a slight bow, left Sir Philip to his task, closing the door behind him. The sound of the key turning in the lock once more, from the outside, sent a brief, cold shiver down Philip's spine. He was now alone, and for all intents and purposes, locked in. But it was a necessary isolation. He was now free to conduct his search without fear of interruption. He stood for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the gloom. The room was small, stone-walled, and windowless, a secure vault designed to protect its precious contents from the ravages of time and fire. The only light came from the single heavy torch he had been given, its flickering orange flame casting long, dancing shadows that made the small chamber feel alive with furtive, secret movement. The air in the room was thick, dry, and heavy with the scent of ages. It was a smell unique to such places, a complex and evocative perfume of old, brittle paper, of decaying, leather-bound ledgers, and of fine, powdery dust that had been left undisturbed for generations. It was the smell of forgotten time, of words and promises and histories that had been sealed away in the darkness. The chamber was filled, almost from floor to ceiling, with towering, dark wooden shelves, each one groaning under the immense weight of its contents. There were massive, leather-bound books, their spines stamped with the faded, gilded crest of the Lovell family. There were tall stacks of rolled parchment, tied with faded, brittle ribbons. And against the far wall, there were 3 large, iron-strapped wooden chests, their lids closed, their contents a mystery. The farmer's story had prepared him for what he might find, but the reality of it was still a shock. The room was in a state of controlled yet undeniable chaos. This was not the neat, ordered archive of a well-managed estate. This was the scene of a frantic, desperate search. Books had been pulled hastily from the shelves and left open on the floor, their delicate pages exposed to the damp air. Stacks of parchment had been untied and sifted through, their contents left in a jumbled, disorganized heap on a large central table. It was clear that someone, Sir Walter, had been here, and had been looking for something with a terrible, feverish urgency. The lingering aura of his panicked, guilty energy still seemed to hang in the dusty air, and the faint, acrid smell of burnt paper that Elric's kitchen maid had detected still lingered, a ghostly, almost imperceptible undertone beneath the stronger sense of dust and decay. Philip looked towards the small, stone hearth in the corner of the room. It was cold and black, but in the fine gray ash that coated its bottom, he could see the telltale, blackened, and curled remains of several small scraps of burnt parchment that had escaped the main blaze, a final, damning confirmation of the old farmer's tale. With a grim sense of purpose, Philip set his torch in a wall sconce and began his own search. But he was not looking for what Sir Walter had been looking for. He was looking for what Sir Walter had missed. The man had been in a hurry, his search fueled by fear and a guilty conscience. A man in such a state is prone to making mistakes, to overlooking things. Philip's search, by contrast, would be slow, methodical, and meticulous. He started with the shelves, running his fingers along the spines of the great, dusty ledgers, pulling out any that seemed to deal with the late lord's personal affairs, his will, or the direct line of inheritance. He spent hours poring over the dense, spidery script of legal documents, his eyes straining in the flickering, inadequate torchlight. He found records of land purchases, of marriage settlements, of disputes with neighbors that went back for centuries. It was a fascinating, detailed history of a noble family, but it contained nothing that pointed to treachery, nothing that Sir Walter would have felt the need to destroy. He moved on to the jumbled piles of parchment on the central table, carefully unrolling each one, his hands gentle with the brittle, ancient documents. He found personal letters, their ink faded to a pale brown, filled with the mundane, everyday concerns of the long dead. A mother's letter to her son at university, a lord's instructions to his steward, a young lady's lovesick poetry. It was an intimate and poignant glimpse into the lives of his friend's ancestors. But again, he found nothing. There was no hidden codicil to a will, no secret deed, no damning contract. Whatever Sir Walter had been so desperate to find and destroy, it seemed he had been successful. A cold tendril of despair began to creep into Philip's heart. Had he been wrong? Had he come to a dead end? Had the traitor been so thorough as to erase every single trace of his crime? Refusing to surrender, he turned his attention to the last remaining possibility. The 3 large, wooden chests against the far wall. They were bound with straps of black iron and secured with heavy, rusted padlocks. Using a small, sharp pry bar he had brought with him, he forced the locks one by one, the sound of the old, rusted metal groaning and then snapping with a loud crack seeming like a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the room. He opened the first chest. It was filled with old, discolored maps of the estate and the surrounding lands, beautifully drawn but long since rendered obsolete by the shifting course of rivers and the growth of forests. The second chest contained a collection of family heirlooms of a more personal, less official nature. A child's first riding crop, a collection of faded, pressed flowers, a lock of a baby's golden hair tied with a blue ribbon. They were objects of pure sentiment, heartbreaking in their simple, human intimacy, but they were not what he was looking for. He moved to the third and final chest, his last hope. It was the largest and oldest of the 3, its wood a dark, almost black oak. He pried open the lock and lifted the heavy lid. This chest was filled with letters, hundreds of them, tied in neat, orderly bundles with ribbons of varying colors. He lifted out one of the bundles. The letters were written in a delicate, elegant, and distinctly feminine hand. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to the late Lady Lovell, his friend's wife, a woman of great beauty and gentle spirit who had passed away several years before, a victim of a wasting sickness. These were her personal letters, a lifetime of correspondence. It felt like a deep and profound violation to be looking through them, but he knew he must. Sir Walter's secret, if it existed, would be hidden in the most personal and private corners of the family's history. He began to sift through the bundles, his touch as reverent as possible. He scanned the contents of a few letters. They were mostly what he expected. Letters to her parents, to her sisters, to her friends, filled with news of her children, descriptions of court life, and expressions of her deep and abiding love for her husband. He was about to give up, to close the chest, to admit defeat, when he noticed something. As he lifted the last few bundles of letters from the chest, he saw that the wooden panel at the very bottom did not sit quite right. There was a faint, almost invisible seam around its edges, a seam that should not have been there. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy, hopeful rhythm. He placed the torch on the floor beside him and leaned over the chest, examining the bottom panel closely. He pressed on one corner, and it moved, just slightly with a faint, soft click. It was a false bottom, a secret compartment, a place to hide the most precious, and perhaps the most dangerous of secrets. With his heart now hammering against his ribs, he used the tip of his dagger to carefully pry up the edge of the loose panel. It lifted easily, revealing a shallow, hidden space beneath. The space was not empty. His search at last had borne fruit. Inside the hidden compartment, nestled on a bed of faded, dark blue velvet, were a few small, deeply personal items. A child's silver rattle, a small, exquisitely painted miniature portrait of a baby, and a single, folded letter. The letter was sealed with a small, neat blob of dark blue wax. And the seal, he saw with the jolt that went through his entire body, did not bear the proud, rampant lion of the Lovell family crest. It bore the delicate, personal signet of the late Lady Lovell herself. A single, graceful swan. This was a letter she had hidden. A letter that was meant for no one's eyes but her husband's. A letter that, for whatever reason, he had never received, or had chosen to hide away in the most secret of places. And Philip knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as sharp as his own dagger, that he was holding the secret to everything. He had found what Sir Walter had so desperately, and so unsuccessfully, been looking for. The discovery of the false bottom in the ancient chest sent a jolt of pure, electric energy through Sir Philip Harclay. The long, frustrating hours of his search, the dust, the gloom, the creeping despair, all of it vanished in an instant, replaced by a sharp, focused, and triumphant excitement. He had been right. Sir Walter's frantic, clumsy search had been incomplete. The traitor, in his haste and his guilt, had missed this one final and most crucial of hiding places. Kneeling on the cold, dusty stone floor of the records room, with only the single, flickering torch casting a small, brave circle of light in the oppressive darkness, Philip felt like a miner who, after a lifetime of fruitless toil, had just struck a rich vein of pure, unadulterated gold. But this was a treasure far more precious, and far more dangerous, than any earthly metal. This was a treasure of truth. His hands, which had been so steady throughout his methodical search, now trembled slightly as he reached into the shallow, velvet-lined, hidden compartment. The space was a secret cache, a time capsule of a mother's most private sentiments. The small, personal items he saw first, the tarnished silver rattle, the tiny, exquisitely painted miniature of a laughing, golden-haired baby he recognized as his friend's son, Edmund, brought a sharp, sudden pang of grief. These were the cherished mementos of the late Lady Lovell, a woman he had admired for her gentle spirit and quiet strength. To be touching them felt like a profound and intimate intrusion, a violation of her memory. But his duty to her husband, and to the living son she had left behind, overrode his sense of trespass. Tucked beneath the miniature portrait was the object of his search, the reason for this desecration of memory. It was the single, folded letter. He lifted it from the chest with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. The paper was thick and of high quality, but it had yellowed with age, and it felt fragile and brittle to the touch. It was folded neatly, and sealed with a small, precise, and unbroken blob of dark blue wax. He held it closer to the torchlight. The seal was, as he had first thought, not the proud lion of the Lovell family, but the delicate, personal signet of the lady herself. A single, graceful swan, its neck arched in a gesture of serene beauty. This was a letter from the grave, a message from a dead woman, hidden away from the world, a message that, he now knew with an unshakable certainty, contained the key to his friend's murder. The wax seal, still intact after all these years, seemed to pulse with a faint, latent energy in the wavering light, a final, fragile barrier protecting a terrible and dangerous truth. With a deep breath that seemed to draw all the dusty, ancient air of the chamber into his lungs, he carefully, painstakingly, broke the brittle seal. The dry wax cracked with a faint, sharp snap, a sound that was shockingly loud in the tomb-like silence of the room. He unfolded the letter. The paper rustled with a dry, whispering sound, a sound like autumn leaves or a dying breath. The interior was filled with a delicate, elegant, and beautifully flowing script, a handwriting that was as graceful and as refined as the woman who had penned it. The ink, once a vibrant blue, had faded over time to a soft, cornflower gray, but the words were still perfectly, chillingly legible. The letter was addressed to her husband, his friend, "My dearest and most beloved lord." As Philip began to read, the dusty, forgotten records room seemed to fade away, and he was transported back in time, a silent, spectral witness to the fears and sorrows of a long-dead woman. The letter began with expressions of deep and abiding love, words of such genuine, heartfelt affection for her husband and her young son that they brought a fresh wave of grief to Philip's own heavy heart. She wrote of her joy in their life together, of her hopes for their future, of the simple, everyday happiness that had been so cruelly stolen from them all. But then, about halfway through the letter, the tone began to shift. The warm, loving words were slowly, insidiously replaced by a new and chilling note of fear, of anxiety, of a deep and profound mistrust. She was writing about her husband's brother, Sir Walter Lovell. "My love," the faded script read, "I must unburden my heart to you of a great and heavy fear, a fear I have held in silence for too long, for I did not wish to trouble your noble spirit with what may be naught but a woman's foolish fancies. But the shadow that has fallen upon my health has made me bold, for I fear I may not have the time to speak of these things to you in person. It is your brother, Walter, who is the source of my disquiet." Philip's own heart began to pound a slow, heavy, and dreadful rhythm. This was it, the confirmation, the proof. "I know you love him," the letter continued, "and see in him only a younger brother in need of guidance. But my husband, I see something else. I have seen a darkness in his soul, a deep and bitter shadow that he hides behind a mask of cheerful deference. I have seen the way he looks at you when your back is turned, a look that is not of brotherly affection, but of a deep, corrosive, and terrible jealousy. He covets what you have, my lord, not just your wealth and your title, but your happiness, your name, your very life. He looks upon our son, our sweet Edmund, not with an uncle's love, but with the cold, calculating eyes of a man looking at an obstacle." The words were a dagger in Philip's heart. He could picture it all so clearly, the good, noble, and perhaps slightly naive Lord Lovell, completely blind to the viper he was nurturing in his own home. He read on, his hands trembling, the torchlight seeming to waver and dance in time with his own ragged breathing. "He is a man consumed by greed, my love. A few months past, while you were away at court, he came to me in my chambers. He brought with him a document, a legal paper of some sort, filled with a great many words that I did not understand. He told me it was a simple matter of estate management, a paper that you had wished for me to sign in your absence. He was charming, his voice a balm of reason, but his eyes, my love, his eyes were not calm. They were filled with a sharp, hungry, and predatory light. I did not trust him. I told him I would not sign any paper without your presence and your counsel. And the mask fell. For a moment, just a moment, I saw the true man beneath. The charm vanished, and his face became a thing of pure, cold, and venomous rage. He spoke to me in a low voice, a voice of such menace that it chilled my very blood. He told me that I was a fool, that I was standing in the way of the family's destiny. He took the document back and left me, but not before giving me a look of such profound and naked hatred that I have not slept a peaceful night since. I did not tell you of this, for I did not wish to be the cause of a rift between you and your own blood, and I prayed that his dark mood would pass. But it has not. It festers. I fear him, my husband. I fear what his jealousy and his greed may drive him to do. I fear for you, and I fear for our son." The letter ended with a final, heartbreaking plea for her husband to be watchful, to trust his own good heart but not to be blind to the serpent he held in his midst. She had signed it simply, "Your loving and fearful wife, Margaret." Philip finished reading and slowly, carefully, refolded the fragile paper. He held in his hand not just a letter, but the final, desperate testament of a woman who had seen the truth with a terrifying clarity. The letter was not direct proof of murder, he knew that. It would not stand up in a court of law. But it was something far more powerful. It was a perfect, undeniable, and utterly damning portrait of Sir Walter's character, his motive, and his long-held, treacherous intentions. The ghost's whisper of betrayer now had a name, a face, and a history of cold, calculating malice. The farmer's tale of the burning papers now had a clear and terrible context. Sir Walter had not just been destroying evidence of his own recent crime. He had been frantically searching for and destroying any evidence of his past treachery, any proof, like this letter, that would expose the true, rotten nature of his character. All the disparate, terrible pieces of the puzzle now snapped into place with a horrifying, perfect alignment. The ancient, whispering grief of the castle. The ghostly, rattling sorrow of the armor. The brutal, crushing dent in the breastplate. The indelible, accusing stain of blood. The single, whispered word from a dead man's soul. The strange, secretive actions on the night of the murder. And now this, a hidden letter, a dead wife's desperate warning. It all pointed in one single, undeniable direction. Sir Walter Lovell, the new baron, was a liar, a traitor, and a murderer. Philip carefully placed the precious letter inside his own coat, tucking it away in a secure inner pocket, its fragile paper resting against his heart. It felt both as heavy as a lead weight and as hot as a burning coal. He now had the moral proof, the earthly confirmation he had so desperately needed. The ghost's vision was not a madness. It was a truth, and this letter was the key that had unlocked it. He felt a new and terrible resolve solidify within him, a resolve as cold and as hard as the stones of the castle itself. His fear was gone, replaced by a righteous, all-consuming fury. He was no longer just a man with suspicions. He was a man with evidence. He was a man with a sacred duty. His quest was no longer just to find the truth. It was to see justice done. And his next step, he knew with a final, chilling certainty, was to return to the path the ghost had set him on. He had to find the grotto. He had to find the sword. He had to bring the physical proof of the murder to light and lay it at the feet of the man who had committed the crime. The hunt was on. Kneeling in the dusty, silent darkness of the records room, Sir Philip Harclay felt the chaotic, swirling pieces of the terrible puzzle finally lock into place, forming a single, clear, and horrifying image. The letter, now safely tucked away in the inner pocket of his coat, its fragile paper resting like a sacred, damning relic against his heart, was the final, crucial piece, the key that unlocked the meaning of all the other fragments of horror he had collected. It was a catalyst, a lens through which all the strange, unsettling, and supernatural events of the past days now came into sharp, terrible focus. The world, which had seemed a maelstrom of confusion, of ghostly whispers and troubling suspicions, now possessed a terrifying, diamond-hard clarity. The truth, in all its ugly, treacherous glory, had finally taken shape. He thought back to his arrival at Lovell Castle, to the pervasive, oppressive atmosphere of grief that seemed to emanate from the very stones. He had mistaken it for a simple, communal sorrow for a lost master. But now he understood. It was not just the grief of the living he had been sensing. It was the ancient, lingering sorrow of the castle itself, a place that had been forced to bear silent witness to a terrible, fratricidal crime. The stones themselves remembered. They held the echo of the treachery, a stain on the castle's soul that could not be washed away by the simple passage of time. The coldness he felt in the halls, the sense of unwelcoming dread, it was the castle's own quiet, eternal protest against the false lord who now walked its halls, a man whose hands were stained with the blood of his own brother, the castle's true and rightful master. This ancient structure was a silent, brooding character in the tragedy, its sorrow a constant, atmospheric testament to the crime. His mind then turned to the armory, to that silent, steel-clad effigy in its shadowed alcove. The memory was no longer just a terrifying, isolated supernatural event. It was now a chapter in a coherent, unfolding narrative. The ghostly whisper of betrayer was no longer a cryptic, disembodied accusation from a nameless ghost. It now had a name and a face, supplied by the dead woman's letter. It was the spirit of his murdered friend, using its last, fading vestiges of power to give him the one, single, most important word he needed to begin his quest. The violent, death rattle of the armor, the crushing dent in the breastplate, the indelible, accusing bloodstain, they were not just random horrors. They were a deliberate, spectral reenactment, a desperate pantomime of the murder itself, a silent, terrible play staged by the victim for an audience of one. The ghost had been showing him, in the only way it could, not just that a betrayal had occurred, but how it had occurred, with a brutal, crushing, and dishonorable blow from a heavy weapon, a blow delivered by Sir Walter. And the old farmer's tale, the simple, earthly testimony of a loyal and observant man, now fit perfectly into the terrible mosaic. Sir Walter's strange, furtive behavior on the night his brother's body was brought home. His frantic, obsessive need to lock himself away in these very archives. It was the panicked, guilty scrabbling of a murderer trying to cover his tracks. The smell of burning parchment was the smell of a man desperately trying to erase his own history of malice, to destroy any document, any letter, like the one Philip now carried, that might reveal the true, black nature of his character and his long-held, jealous motives. He had been trying to erase the why of his crime, to ensure that no one would ever have a reason to look too closely at his brother's convenient and supposedly natural death. He had almost succeeded, but he had missed one small, secret compartment. He had missed his sister-in-law's final, damning testament, hidden away by a husband who perhaps feared his brother even more than he let on. Finally, there was the dream, the terrifying, vivid, and deeply symbolic vision of the grotto and the sword. It was no longer a mere nightmare, a product of his own troubled psyche. It was a direct, purposeful communication from the other side, a continuation of the ghost's desperate attempts to reveal the full truth. The grotto was the secret burial place of the evidence. The spectral, blood-stained sword was the physical proof of the crime, the very instrument of the murder, hidden away in a place where Sir Walter believed it would never be found. The ghost, unable to speak plainly, unable to name its killer in a way the world of men would accept, had done the only thing it could. It had given him a map. It had shown him the location of the one, single piece of tangible evidence that could prove the murder and expose the lie beyond all doubt. All of Ithcastle's sorrowful atmosphere, the ghost's whisper, the farmer's memory, the wife's hidden letter, and the dream vision of the sword, all of it now pointed in one, single, undeniable direction, like a compass needle swinging inexorably towards a terrible, magnetic north. It all pointed to Sir Walter Lovell, the man who now sat as the baron of this great castle, the man who was the legal guardian of his own victim's son, was a usurper, a traitor, and a murderer of his own blood. Philip carefully and reverently replaced the other items in the hidden compartment, closed the false bottom, and arranged the letters on top, leaving the chest exactly as he had found it. He rose to his feet, the single torch in his hand seeming to burn with a new, brighter, and more purposeful light. A new and terrible resolve, as cold and as hard as the steel of the spectral sword, had settled in his heart. The fear he had felt, the confusion, the sense of being a man lost in a fog of supernatural horror, was gone. It had been burned away, replaced by the white-hot fire of a righteous and holy fury. He now had the truth. He now had the moral certainty. He now had the earthly corroboration of a dead woman's warning to support the unearthly testimony of a murdered man's ghost. He felt the weight of his promise to that restless spirit, not as a burden, but as a sacred charge, a knight's solemn vow. He was his friend's champion, his son's protector, and the executor of a justice that transcended the laws of men and touched upon the eternal laws of right and wrong. His path forward, which had been so shrouded in doubt, was now terrifyingly, dangerously clear. His quest had been broken down into a series of tangible, albeit perilous, steps. The first phase, the gathering of intelligence, was complete. He now possessed a secret that made him the most dangerous man in Lovell Castle, a secret that Sir Walter would kill to protect. His next step was to transition from investigator to explorer. He had to act on the ghostly map from his dream. He had to search the castle's foundations, to find the secret passage, to locate the hidden grotto. It seemed an impossible task, but the vision had been too vivid, too real, for it not to be true. He would find it, and once he found it, he would have to retrieve the sword, the final, irrefutable proof. And then would come the final, most dangerous phase, the confrontation. He would have to face Sir Walter, not with whispers and suspicions, but with the very instrument of his crime, a blade that still bore the spectral, indelible stain of his brother's noble blood. The game had changed. He was no longer just a guest in Lovell Castle, testing the waters of a suspicious death. He was a hunter, and he would not rest, would not falter, until he had unearthed the castle's darkest secret, dragged it out into the light, and seen justice, both earthly and divine, finally and satisfyingly, done. He took one last look around the dusty, silent records room, a place that had given him the key he so desperately needed, and then, with the damning letter resting securely against his heart, he went to the door to face the world of the living, now armed with the secrets of the dead. A ghost's whisper, a farmer's memory, and a dead woman's secret letter, the web of betrayal tightens around Sir Walter Lovell. But with this knowledge, Sir Philip is now in more danger than ever before. What did Sir Walter truly hide? Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.